talking enough. And so I'm getting excited to turn this one over to Fran. But let me first introduce him. Fran Zablocki is a strategist at mStoner and helps institutions create websites, print, social media, and mobile projects. Fran brings many years of experience to higher education, web communication strategy, and project management experience to mStoner. He's presented at a number of conferences, including Hive Web national and regional events, the .edu Guru Summit, and SUNY Quad. He's also been a guest host and producer on Higher Ed Live, which airs every Thursday night at 7 p.m. During today's session, you can tweet Fran at Zablocki, and don't forget to use that hashtag mStonerNow. So Fran, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Mallory, and thank you everyone who is joining me this afternoon or potentially morning if you're on the West Coast for this webinar. As Mallory mentioned, the webinar's title is Information Architecture, the Journey, the Destination, and the Return Trip. I've got a lot of slides here. I seem to add a couple slides to my maximum and break my own record every time I do one of these webinars, so I'm going to move pretty quickly here. We're going to leave time for questions at the end. I'm going to cover a lot of ground. This is meant to be a presentation on a very comprehensive view of information architecture, and so put your seatbelts on. It's going to be a quick ride, and I will obviously be sharing all of these slides afterwards. There's a lot of different resources that you're going to want to take a look at after this because I'm going to be going through them pretty quick, and you might not be able to capture them as I'm talking about them. Okay, so let's get started. Information architecture. What are we going to be talking about today? Well, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction. I'm going to talk about what information architecture is and what it is not. I'm going to talk about the elements of IA, and that's the real meat of this presentation. That's where we get into a lot of the different things that you're probably already familiar with how we do things on the web in higher education. And then I'm going to wrap things up with two sections, one on the future of information architecture and emerging trends that are going to affect all of us in this field, and IA as a practice, and some tips on what you can do at your institution to institute information architecture, and some resources that you can follow up on with for professional development. So from here out, I'm going to call information architecture IA for brevity's sake. And I've got a useful little information architecture of my own for this presentation in navigation. So this will indicate where I am at any given time and what is up next. Okay, introduction. About me. It's already been covered by Mallory. I'm a strategist at mStoner. I've been working in the web in higher education for over a decade, and I've done many, many different projects involving information architecture back when I was working at Nazareth College, SUNY Geneseo, and now for mStoner. You can reach me on Twitter at @Zablocki, and again, to reiterate that this presentation is being broadcast on the hashtag mStonerNow as well on Twitter, so please do join the back channel conversation. All right, so what is information architecture? We're going to go through a little history. We're going to try to define information architecture and talk about information architecture's larger family of user experience, and then we're going to see if maybe you're an information architect. So the history of information architecture starts actually since human beings started categorizing things and labeling them and organizing things. So scientific method is probably the ancient history, but the more recent history of how we get into information architecture as a practice starts with library and information science. And really, if anybody remembers, and I'm sure we all do, the Dewey Decimal System and card catalogs from way back in the day when we actually used physical things to look up other things, you'll remember that library and information science really involves the categorization of information. And we do that using a lot of different labels. We do that using a lot of different numbers. But really, it was the library scientists in the beginning who were asked when websites first became a thing to figure out how we're supposed to organize content on it. I mean, let's be honest, in the beginning, no one really organized anything. But once websites got to be taken seriously as a device for communicating information, it was really these folks that it fell on to do the heavy lifting. And the reason is because there's actually quite a bit of parallel between what we do on the web and what librarians do in a library. And obviously, the two have converged in digital librarianship recently. But we all organize and classify information on our websites just like you would in a library. Labeling on a website is very similar to the practice of taxonomy in library sciences, figuring out what things should be called, figuring out what the official thing something should be called is. Browsing on a website is very similar to what you do when you go into a library for reference. You browse the halls, you browse the different shelves. And navigation on a website is very similar to the role that a physical, real human being librarian would play to give you guidance as you tried to find the information you were looking for. So moving ahead into the early web, we didn't have to worry about too much other than information architecture. We didn't really have the ability to do styling, so we didn't have styling. So the early websites really were pure information architecture. Those were the good old days of IA before everything else took over and it got put underwater into the big iceberg of invisible work that it is now. So here's an example from the Internet Wayback Machine for Harvard University. And this is the very first entry that Harvard University had back in 1997. And you can see that outside of a little 8-bit logo that they've got there, there's really very little, oh, and a little Vine icon for the Veritas Information Network. There's really very little but information architecture here. And so it's important to understand that really information architecture, despite the fact that it is a major part of the practice of web development and design now, was originally really the only way that we can convey information online. As the web has progressed and grown up, it has come a long way. Websites, as we all know, in the last 20 years have become much, much more complex. They've become much, much more interactive. But the reality is that IA is still the backbone of all websites. So let me just show a couple quick examples here of two websites that are doing some very fancy things with design and interface that are still really fundamentally about the information architecture. So this is the University of Notre Dame. They have a wonderful parallax. Oh, we're going to do this. You're going to bear with me for a second as I get my screen set up. Okay, so we're going to look at this real quick. The University of Notre Dame, they have a nice parallax navigation. Things slide and scroll behind. But ultimately, it's still just information architecture. It's got to be well organized. Next example is Webster University. Webster University has a responsive website, as many of us do these days, but information architecture, again, still the backbone of the website. You can see two different examples here. The bottom one is the desktop and what they show for their primary navigation there. The top one is what you see when you go onto a mobile site, and you just see the word navigation, and that drops down into the rest of their information architecture structure. So let's take a look at that real quick. And this is fun to do if you're ever bored. Go to a responsive website and just start to play around with the navigation. So you can see as I get smaller, the information architecture gets restructured near the top. And you can see that ultimately once I get to tablet or mobile size, that information is actually being buried underneath a tab. Oh my gosh, you can see the Twitter's going on in the background right now as we speak. It's amazing. Okay, so let me get back to my thing here. All right. So despite the fact that we've come a long way, information architecture is still really one of the fundamental building blocks, if not the fundamental building block, of content on the web. That does not mean it's gotten any easier to define, though. I am pulling this definition, or actually these three definitions, from a book which I reference all the time called Information Architecture for the World Wide Web. It was published, it's actually has 3 versions. It's Peter Morville and Louis Rosenfeld. You'll see them called out many times during the process of this presentation. This particular book is really just what I consider the Bible for what we do with information architecture online. And they define information architecture, in the latest version is 2006, as 3 things: the structured design of shared information environments, the combination of organization, labeling, search, and navigation systems within websites and intranets, and the art and science of shaping information products and experiences to support usability and findability. So even they, being founders of this field, and these guys are really two of the people who made information architecture, period, what it is as a practice, have a difficult time defining what it is. It's a lot of different things. It's somewhat ambiguous. Well, let's start to try to define it by what it is. Maybe we do process of elimination here. Information architecture is not graphic design. It is not software development. It's not usability engineering. It's not information design, and it's not interaction design. All those things are practices unto themselves, and they're interrelated, as we'll see in a little while. But information architecture is most certainly not any of these things. Well, what is it then? Well, ambiguous and mostly invisible and hard to define, really, is what it ultimately comes down to. I mean, these guys have been trying to define this since they started it. We're in 2013, and it really hasn't gotten any easier. In fact, it's gotten harder. So I'll just pull a direct quote from Morville and Rosenfeld that I just love, because the reality is you can think you know how to do something, and you can think, maybe I really need to work on this, or you can think, I'm a complete idiot and I have no idea how to do this particular field. But when the people who invent the field say something like this, it really puts everything into perspective. So the work we do, that being information architecture, involves high levels of abstraction, ambiguity, and occasionally absurdity. And to some degree, we're all still making it up as we go along. So keep that in mind as we're going through all of this, that this is a practice that is not a science. It's a science and an art. There are methods, but there is also a good deal of jazz involved with this. There's a good deal of intuition involved with this. So it's a very exciting place to work, because it's something that you can mix left brain and right brain and really form something new from structures that have existed before. Okay. Continuing to try to define information architecture through an analogy of physical architecture. I've heard this used many times, and I have used it myself many times. It's a very good kind of intro to information architecture, a little 101 comparison. People understand physical architecture. They understand going into a building and having a building do things for them. And there are a lot of similarities, and I would encourage you to use this analogy, but just realize that it does have its limits. So just like a physical piece of architecture, information architecture is a planned structure. You have a blueprint for a physical structure. You have an information architecture diagram for an IA. Both combine form and function, some more so than others. The best actually balance the two gracefully and elegantly. Both of them have designated pathways. So you have pathways of people finding information on your website, and the building has pathways for people to find the place that they need to go. Hallways, elevators, signage on the walls to help them get there. But that analogy only goes so far, because eventually it breaks down because of ninjas. Yes, because most buildings aren't designed to be entered by the window, the ceiling, and the plumbing. But most websites have to be, right? Our users are accessing our websites from every possible angle. And that's the beauty of the web and the challenge of the web at the same time, is that people will try to get access to your site in ways that you could never possibly anticipate. So what do we do to fight the ninjas? Well, we don't fight the ninjas. We welcome them in. We join them. We don't want to necessarily make things harder on them, but how do we actually tackle all of this? Good question. All right, I'm still going through definitions, by the way, and I'm 15 slides in. I just want to point out that that's how difficult it is to actually put a finger on exactly what information architecture is. But we're still trying here, and I think the guy who actually did the best job of visualizing this for me is the guy, that Jesse James Garrett, who wrote The Elements of User Experience. So around 2000, the year 2000, Jesse James Garrett creates this diagram, puts it up on the web for free, doesn't think too much of it, and it ends up getting, for the time, going viral and getting like 20,000 views online, which is not a lot now, but back then was a ton. And the reason why it was so popular was because it took all of these disparate elements and all this ambiguity and all this lack of definition and the iceberg being so far underwater and trying to figure out what exactly all this stuff was and meant, and it put a really clean, clear visual to it. So the way he approaches building of a website is that he layers things like a cake in 5 different layers. And at the bottom of the cake is strategy. By the way, those of you who've watched my previous presentations know that I always somehow manage to slide cake in as some reference, because I love cake. Anyway, that's an aside. So what Jesse James Garrett did was put this all into a layered structure. It goes from bottom to top: strategy, scope, structure, skeleton, and surface. It goes at the bottom from the most abstract concepts to the top, the most concrete concepts. So where we end up looking at things online for a website is the surface, the concrete area. That's what the finished product looks like. But look at how much goes into this website before you actually get to that top surface level area. And I'm not going to dive too deep into this because it does get deeper with this diagram, but it's important to figure out when we're talking about information architecture, or really any of these types of work that we do on the web, where they fit within the context of all the other pieces. And I really don't think I've found a model that makes this clearer than Jesse James Garrett's model. And it is actually a pretty complicated model, but I think it just makes it as clear as possible. So this is that same diagram taken and broken down by the different disciplines that people use. You can see down at the bottom in the strategy area, you're identifying site objectives and user needs. You're moving up 2 levels to the information architecture and interaction design stage. They're really 2 halves of the same coin. And then ultimately you're going up to the visual design area. Now, I think that this model could be its own presentation and probably its own course. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I do want to just highlight a couple of different things about information architecture in the context of the larger user experience world that can help us figure out where we're standing when we're working in IA. So IA is smack in the middle of this model on the structure plane with interaction design. But it's not interaction design. It's actually kind of the other side of the coin, right? So if IA is the structure of the content, interaction design is the structure of the experience. And if IA is the structure and order and hierarchy of the labeling that we use on the site, information design is the hover state or the slide out effect in the behavior of that structure. Now, in practice and in reality, all these things get so jumbled up together that it's easy to forget that they're distinct things. And that therein lies the ambiguity, is there's a lot of gray area and there's a lot of crossover with a lot of this stuff. So anyway, now that your head is probably spinning, as mine was the first time that I read this, let's talk about something a little bit more concrete. What does an information architect look like? Look in the mirror. You are all information architects. Why? Because information architecture draws from many disciplines. It is a new discipline. However, all new disciplines have their influences, and information architecture is no different. Well, what are some of the influences for IA? You're going to recognize a couple of these. As we mentioned before, information and library science being the most direct correlation, but there's a lot of correlation with journalism. Journalists organize information based on timeliness. Marketers understand their audiences and their users. Graphic and information designers create relationships between visual elements to communicate more effectively. So if you have any experience in any of those areas, then you are likely a good information architect, or you could be a really great information architect. In addition to those, content strategy and content strategists, they're concerned with content hierarchy and planning out how content is placed on a web page and overall as content models. Technical writers are worried about content organization and clarity and information design, normally on a printed page, but it's very analogous to the way that information is organized on a website as well. And content management, which I'm sure all of us are familiar with because we use CMSs every day, is the managing of the evolving IA structure over time. And Peter Morville and Louis Rosenfeld, they're smart guys. I quote them a lot. Again, with a really insightful piece into what we do with content management and information architecture, that they're really 2 sides of the same coin. Information architecture portrays a snapshot or a spatial view of an information system at a moment in time, while content management describes a temporal view by showing how that information would flow into, around, and out of that same system over time. All makes perfect sense, I'm sure. Okay, so that's high level, very conceptual definitions and relationships that exist with information architecture and user experience. Let's jump into the elements of information architecture itself. Let's get into this. First up being strategy. We'll take a look at user browsing behavior. We'll look at all the organizational schemes and structures that are familiar to many of us. We'll talk about labeling a little bit, and then we'll talk about process. Okay, Here's the meat of the presentation. Information architecture is a strategy-first approach. If you remember back to Jesse James Garrett's diagram, strategy is the foundation on which all this stuff is built. Information architecture is 2 levels up, but it needs to follow the same strategic goals that you set for the site in the very beginning of your project. So our strategic goals normally as a higher education website would be to sell your institution to users, to provide relevant, timely information to those users, and to transact, to allow them to apply, donate, and contact. And one aspect of information architecture, which is key for information architects who work in multiple industries and really are doing this from scratch, are the core elements of information architecture. So from a strategic point of view, IA breaks down into 3 things: users, context, and content. And I'm not spending as much time as I would on this if this was for a cross-industry presentation, because luckily for us, 2 of the 3 of these are figured out for the most part. We know who our users are, right? Perspectives first. There are many more, but perspectives are our primary users. They're our primary audience. Context is higher education and marketing and awareness building for higher education. So we already understand our context when we walk in. Content really is the area that we have the most variance with. And so we're going to be talking a little bit more about content as well. But before we get into some of that, I want to talk about user browsing behavior, which I find fascinating. How many different meetings have you been in where someone tells you, well, this is what prospective students are looking for. This is what they're going to do. They're going to go to click to this, and then they're going to click to that, and they're going to do that and that and that. Okay, so this is what we think users do. They go to the home page. They go to the academics page. They go to the majors page. They find the English major that they're looking for. They look at the degree requirements and say, hey, I can do that. And then they apply. And then we make money. It's so simple. It's not that simple. Okay, what users actually do. Okay, and this is actually over 3 separate sessions, because nowadays it's not just sitting in front of a laptop. You're on a mobile phone. They Google English degrees. They find your English department. If you're using good search engine optimization, they find the English page. They look at the English major in your academic section. Then they're like, wait a minute, there's an information for future students link over here on this part of the page, and click on that. And then wait a minute, I'm going to contact, oh, the voice is on. I can't do anything else. I got to watch my favorite TV show, so I'm going to bookmark this site. That's session 1. Session 2, this time they're on their iPad. They go into Safari because they're savvy and they've got shared bookmarks in the cloud. They use a bookmark degree page. Then they dive right into everything you've ever written on the English major, right there on their tablet. They click on the Apply Now link, and oh my God, my friend just sent me a Facebook link with a cat that has bacon on its head, and that's the end of session 2. Session 3 is 3 days later. They're on a laptop. They Google Apply to your English program because that's what they remember doing the last time, and they forgot to bookmark this last in session 2. They get lost browsing the admission site full of student videos, which is not a bad thing. Then they click Apply Now, they complete the application process, and then they probably choose another school anyway. Or we profit. Okay, so not quite the same as the simple, sequential, linear process that we normally think it is. So user behavior is something that is very, very difficult to predict. And in fact, to help us out, we can break down user behavior and do a few types so that we can figure out what people might be doing from session to session. All right, I am taking a sip of water because I've been talking very fast and quite a bit, so give me 1 second. Okay, first type of user behavior is known item seeking. This is searching for something that you know is there. This is why faculty and staff are terrible testers for sites dedicated to students, because they just want their quick links. Yeah, they just want them. Why? Because they already know it's there. They use it every single day. They just want to get to it. So never ask a faculty or staff member what should be prioritized on the homepage, because they're going to tell you that they want to get to their email. Now, we're all staff members, maybe some of you are faculty members. That doesn't mean that we don't care about what you need. It's just that the purpose, again, the overall strategy, let's go back to the beginning. Purpose of the site is to cater to prospective students, not faculty and staff. So let's make sure we're not testing a site for prospective students with just faculty and staff. Okay, so that's known item seeking. I know what I want. and I'm searching for it, and I'm going to keep going until I find it. That's another aspect of this particular type of behavior, is people will be perseverant. They will keep going until they find what they're looking for. Whereas somebody who doesn't know it's there in the first place is going to give it a shot, but as soon as they get confused, they're going to give up. All right, the next type of user behavior is exploratory seeking. This is browsing for the unknown, and this is really where most of your prospects are when they start their search. And it's most helped by topical and audience navigation, because topical navigation helps them produce a mental model in their heads about what kind of information is stored in your site and how you've categorized it. It's also helped by audience navigation because it allows them to browse based on who they are. The next type of behavior is exhaustive research. This is finding everything there is to know about whatever it happens to be. This is the point in the exploration process at which someone's probably searching for a particular piece of information on your site, and they're going to click on every single result in that search box until like page 5, and they're going to see everything they can possibly see. Exhaustive research is helped by really good search engine optimization and search results, but it's not typically the first behavior that takes place. This is the return trip, essentially. This is when people have already been to your site and are coming back for more. They decided they want to know more. So that is exhaustive research. There is refinding, which is finding again, which is probably redundant. I could remove that bullet. Sorry about that. But really, this is the bookmarking piece. This is the flagging something for later return. So it's done through bookmarking or browsing history if they're not really that much on the ball. Or if you're like me and you forgot to bookmark, trying a dozen different searches before you remember the right term and then finding that site again. Okay. So as we can see, there's all these different types of user behavior and all these different ways that people journey through our sites. And so it's really one journey, but they take all these different paths to get there. And they move from one form of behavior to another fluidly. And it's usually over several sessions and several devices. And it looks kind of like this. And this is the berry picking model of user behavior, where each of these little circles with a Q in it is a query for a particular type of information. And each of these little color-coded document icons shows the retrieval of that information. So it's not just a one query, one retrieval process, and it's not a straight line. It's all over the place. People find what they're looking for and then decide to look for something else. People find that, decide to look for something else. They may get stopped in the middle of query 2 and query and just jump to a new query without ever actually finding what they were looking for. This is the way real human beings browse the web, and it's good to keep that in mind as we're designing information architecture. So this should provide some fodder for you to become a myth buster with information architecture. How many of us have sat there? Well, someone spots off about how I want to be able to get the information in 3 clicks. If I have to go beyond 3 clicks, it's not working, right? Or they need to be able to find it this way. If they can't find it this way, it's not working. Or this is the way I look at this. This is the way I would find this, so this is the way you need to build it because that's the way I would find it. I'm sure none of you have ever heard this before in your entire lives as web professionals in higher education. But the reality is that it's the berry picking model. People don't do this stuff. 3 clicks is nonsense. It could take them 50 clicks, and as long as they find the thing that they need, that's the important piece. It may be 3 clicks this session, but 5 clicks next session, and it might just be 1 click to a bookmark in the 3rd session to find what they need. There is no one path, and frankly, the people who are building the website are the last people who should be deciding how people will use it. You need to test things, and I'll have a couple of examples on how to test later on as well. And I will return, again, back to Peter Morville and Louis Rosenfeld, who have all of these really good quotes in this book that you should totally buy at the end of this session. And they say, we think we can measure the experience of finding by how long it takes, or how many mouse clicks it takes, or how many viewed pages it takes to find the right answer, when often there is no right answer. And that's an eye-opener. I mean, we have a lot of things that we do, search engine optimization and analytics and user path analysis, to try to figure out whether or not people are getting what they need on our websites. And it's valuable. But ultimately, we have to realize that the way people really view websites sometimes has no logic to it, and there is no right answer. So just keep that in mind. Okay, All that said, that's why we need all kinds of different forms of navigation to help users in every possible scenario. If you have no idea how someone's going to use your website, you better provide as many ways as possible for them to find that information. So, organizational schemes and structures. Well, let's break it out. What kind of organizational schemes? Well, the first is the simplest and easiest, and those are exact organizational schemes. These are the ones where if someone asks us to put them together, we're like, oh yeah, that's no problem. Alphabetical and chronological. So alphabetical is easy, right? It's just the A to Z index. We put together everything with A and we alphabetize. Super, super simple. Although notice with this Webster University example that they add more than just an alphabetical list. They chunk everything into individual letter groupings, and they also have each letter at the top as a form of navigation itself. So this is a little bit more of a best in class A to Z index. If such a competition would ever exist, they might win. Okay, this is an example of a chronological information architecture, and this is really almost always automatically generated by the content management system because it's your events listing. It's what happened when, and usually it's whatever is most either most recently happened or will be happening soonest. And so you can see here, this is just actually an example from Europe. That's why the times are all funky. That people, that just shows a listing of events in chronological order. Not to say that you don't need to do some legwork to make sure that the title and the date and everything is formatted correctly, but this is something that should be automatically generated. Okay, those are the easy ones. We got those out of the way first. What other organizational schemes do we have in information architecture? Well, the first one is topic-based, and this is categorized by topic. This is the one we're really familiar with, right? This is the one that gets the most attention in higher education, the one that we talk about all the time, the one that we like to brag about the fact that Michael Stoner really was the first person to put together one of these. Just had to put the plug in there. But this is the list of about academics, in this case research, news and events, and giving. There are variations here, but the reality is that most of our academic websites contain this particular IA or something very close to it. This example is a college of arts and sciences, so notice the lack of some of the things that would be on a university site, such as athletics. So that's a topical navigation defined as something that is essentially how you topically or group categorize things by topic, and it is definitely the primary means of navigation for most of our sites. Okay, audience-based navigation is next. That asks the user, who are you and how do you identify yourself? This is also pretty standard across higher education. You can see in the bottom left-hand corner, Miami University has an information bar, information for current students, alumni, faculty, and staff. Notice conspicuously absent is a link for prospective students. Why? Because the entire site is for prospective students. And because the entire site is structured for prospective students, it's redundant to add something for them. It would just make them think that maybe what they were looking at wasn't actually for them. Okay, that's audience-based navigation. Another ambiguous organizational scheme is task-based navigation, designed to allow someone to accomplish something. Usually uses action verbs as labels. All right, the example I have here, again from Webster University, is find a location. Now, this is not a list of links, but sometimes navigation is just one item. I wanted to make that point as well. It's okay if you only have one item as long as that's the one item you need. And you can see using the action verb find. Okay, so those are different types of organizational schemes based on being exact and ambiguous. Another way of looking at organizational and navigational structures is by what depth they show. So the depth of a scheme could be, in our case, global, local, or hybrid. Again, the topical navigation for the University of Miami and most of our sites also acts as the global navigation, showing the most important high-level groupings of information for your site. The local navigation is really the page-level navigation for an individual section of your site. So you can see that on the left-hand side is a common location for local navigation. And something that's been adopted more and more recently is a combination of the two, really, the mega menu approach. And the mega menu approach allows a user to see the global and local navigation and information architecture together and provides the benefit of giving you one more level of information architecture visible from where you are without needing to jump to another page. So you could argue back and forth the merits of that. It doesn't play well on mobile as much as it does on desktop, but it's definitely something to keep in mind as an option for your information architecture and organization schemes. Okay, so that's depth of scheme. How else can we look at this? We can look at this as breadth of scheme as well. There's a number of different navigation items that convey the breadth of your site. Contextual, supplementary, convenience, and sitemaps. Well, let's take a look at this. Contextual navigation is navigation within the body copy of the page. It allows users to navigate across the breadth of your site from within essentially your body content. And that is something that takes a lot of work and takes a really comprehensive understanding of what you got, what you have on your site, but really adds a ton of value to the overall browsing experience that people have. So this example is from William and Mary. They have all kinds of links that go to different parts of their sites, or their site rather. The next example, supplemental navigation, is the same exact content, but it's this bottom part, the bulleted part. It's essentially the piece that provides support. It wouldn't exist on its own, but it supplements the current content. And so in this case, the next steps and related facts are shown. And that again conveys the breadth of the information that you have on your site. Okay, convenience navigation is quick links. This is the favorite of faculty and staff worldwide. Convenience navigation is debatable as to who it's actually convenient for, but it's navigation that is shortcutted for a particular purpose. It allows you to jump to a number of frequently used items. And lastly, sitemaps. Sitemaps are literally a map of every single page on your site, kind of a visual top-down. And that, I mean, most literally, this is the literal entire breadth of your site, usually, is the sitemap. You want to show every single page. A sitemap that only contains down to a certain level is possible, but not ideal. And it really should give you the 100% of everything that you have on your site. Okay, as if that wasn't enough, those weren't enough ways to organize your information online. We have yet another way to look at it, from the top down or bottom up. So top down organizational structures are hierarchical. These are the ones we're most familiar with. These are the ones we think of the most when we think of information architecture. We design our topical navigation, our audience navigation, our global and local navigations, which are really sometimes the same thing, and then our sitemap. So this is kind of where, at least my impression, is the most of the awarenesses of organizational structures for IA. The other side of this is bottom-up information architecture, and it's known by a few names which you might be familiar with and might not have thought of as information architecture. This is content structure. This is really how you organize, label, and sequence the information that's inside the WYSIWYG editor, inside the body copy editor. So it involves content structure, contextual navigation, which we showed a couple slides ago, and supplementary navigation, again, that William and Mary example. This is an example from Trinity College. Content structure is really, really important. You can't just dump a huge wall of text into a WYSIWYG and expect people to be able to find the information they're looking for, even if your top-down hierarchical navigation is amazing. So content structure involves making sure you have the appropriate weight for headings, character length and heading length, making sure that you have supplemental information such as thumbnails, defining how long of a paragraph that you're going to write for each individual section, and includes contextual navigation. One way to approach bottom-up information architecture is to create content templates. So these are standardized organizational schemes for particular content. It basically gives a consistency of content hierarchy from page to page. So much like you have a uniform top-down information architecture from page to page, you have that global navigation that stays the same every single time. This is from the bottom up. So you have, for example, a standard majors and minors page applied across the entire site. Every time someone's looking at information on a major or minor, they're getting the same content structure. It really helps with consistency, and it helps with usability. So what does that look like? Well, really, it's a big, huge spreadsheet, a content template is, and it allows you to or it's broken up into whether it's required or not. Gives a little bit of a description, what type of information is on there. So you've got text, images, things like that, and you've got size specifications. Really getting granular into like how many characters each thing should be. So that is a content template. An example of something produced from a content template is this example from Wofford College. So you can see that both the body copy and the calls to action are very thoughtfully organized around the content template. Okay, what else is bottom up? Data structure is bottom up. This gets really meta. So data structures and metadata and tagging are how you organize and label the information about the information that's inside the WYSIWYG. Okay, what does this actually do for you? Because this gets a little bit ambiguous. Well, any data-driven website, anything using AJAX or querying databases to get the information displayed to users is using bottom-up information architecture. And the example I have is the Webster Program Finder. Okay, so I go to the Webster Program Finder. I'm trying to figure out. Trying to figure out whether Webster has the stuff I need. And I have all these different categories I can filter on, and it's showing me I have 285 matches. Well, I can go to degree type, and I can check this box, and now all of a sudden it's filtering, and I only have 175 matches. Well, that is using bottom-up information architecture and content tagging and metadata to do all of that in real time. And we're used to doing this kind of thing in outside of higher ed with sites such as Amazon and a lot of the shopping carts that are out there, which are able to basically spit back information to us after we've given real-time criteria. So bottom-up information architecture really helps that. Okay, I'm take another deep breath. I think I'm going to make it. Got a bunch of slides left, though. Okay, last piece in this section is on labeling. Labeling is important, but it's one of those things we take for granted because everything needs a name, right? But a few tips on labeling. You need to know your audience, you need to be efficient, and you need to anticipate what the user will expect to see if they are looking at the label. And I'm going to use an example from outside higher education and even outside web that I think is brilliant. So this is a great example of labeling. If you've ever seen this in a supermarket, this is a company that has taken commonly used cold medicines and other medicines for different ailments and created packaging and a labeling system and really an information architecture to speak to normal human beings and not physicians. So it just says, help, I have a headache. It gives a picture of how big the pill is, and then it gives the details in small print. And honestly, it's like, yeah, I don't really care what all the chemicals are that make this up. I just have allergies, and I want to know what this thing's going to do for me. So they know their audience. It's for people who are normal people, not doctors. It's efficient. There's less than 15 words total on the entire package, and it anticipates what the user wants to see. The image on the outside shows the user how big the actual pills are. So I just thought this was brilliant and worth a mention. And the name of them is actually Help Medicine. That's the name of the company as well. Okay. In the context of higher education websites, though, how does labeling work well? Well, back to our contextual linking model. This label in the William & Mary example says research. Well, where does it lead? We expect it to lead to somewhere that has to do with research. Does it? Well, we're in luck. William & Mary knows what they're doing, and it does lead to a page that has to do with research, and that's reinforced because it shows that we're in the research section. The title of the page is Research and Scholarship, and we even have a little special interest feature on the right-hand side called Research at William & Mary. So you want to make sure that your labels, no matter what they are, contextual labels, primary topical nav labels, match with wherever the destination is. Consistency is huge. And one of the ways you can do that is to have a controlled vocabulary. So controlled vocabulary is really just a uniform method of describing things that provides quality and consistency. And consistency means predictability, and predictability means people are going to continue to explore your site instead of getting confused and lost and going to watch their favorite TV show. Why are controlled vocabularies important? Because labeling is more of an art than a science. And if you ask 10 people at your campus what they would call something, you'll get 10 different answers. If you don't have a standard, you will end up with labels for the same thing that are different all over your site. So having a standard makes it easier for everybody, so follow the standard. Okay. Let's see here. Moving into a different section. All this is great, but what do we actually produce? What does an information architect actually hand to someone and say, look, I made information architecture? All right, some of the process stuff. Top down, the IA list. This is probably the simplest way to represent information architecture. It's my preferred way just because it's quick, it's easy to read, it's easy to modify and maintain, and it's a good way to represent the depth of a site in particular. We organize it by numerical legal structure. Here's an example. Really pretty simple. It's something that can easily be printed out and referred to when people are reviewing. You use that numerical system and tabbing and bolding, and you can create something that is pretty easy to follow along with. So you can see that this actually is a 2-level deep information architecture in the sense that the 1.1 YACTCM is the first level, and the other marketing labels that are like 1.1.1 are actually 2 levels deep. So you can put the entire thing in there. You can put topical, audience, search, footer navigation, all of that. If you were to see the whole document, you would see that all of that is included there. Okay, what's another way to represent top-down in a document? Well, you can do an IA diagram or a sitemap. This is a more visual way to represent information architecture, and a good way to represent the breadth of a site. It's good at showing tangential relationships, such as related sites and references. But it's more work to maintain because it's visual, because it's usually done in a program like Visio. It just takes a little bit more maintenance. However, it's also something that can really convey a lot of complex detail and interrelatedness beyond the main structure of the site. So ultimately, your choice between which one of these to use really needs to balance your need to communicate the information architecture with your timeline and your budget. You could spend the rest of your life creating information architecture diagrams for people and never actually get around to creating websites. So that's why I prefer the first. Not to say that the second isn't valuable, but that's my own personal preference. Okay, how do we create stuff for bottom-up content? Well, we talked about content templates. I'll just mention it one more time. That is a deliverable. That is a document that you can hand to somebody that helps to define what the content should be structured as. How about taking both approaches and combining them into a hybrid? All right, it gets great gas mileage, and it's evolutionary, and it's a shared document. It allows content creation to remain cohesive with the information architecture and content templates all in the same place. So the example I will give you is again, this is from Webster. Let's see if it's going to load here. Here we go. Maybe not. Okay, so this is the Webster University copy assignments page, or at least a sample of it. You can see the information architecture on the left-hand side with all of our major sections. You can see the titles are in that middle column, and then you can see that as we're reviewing this information, we're marking that third column as something that's due because it hasn't come in yet, or we're clicking on the actual hyperlink, and it's not a hyperlink to a new website, it's an anchor to lower down in the document. Jumps to the About Webster page, and we have, look at that, content template, page name, title tag, meta description, keywords, headline, body text, all kinds of stuff that we need. That's all in the same exact document. You can pop that on one URL using Google Docs and never, oops, I clicked TweetDeck instead of Keynote, sorry, and never have to worry about versioning of content ever again. Okay, I actually could use the live example, so we don't need that slide. Last part of process that's really important, and this is the part that you need to convince people, where you're going to be able to convince people that what you're doing isn't just magic and that you can actually back it up with data. So 2 ways to test information architecture are card sorting and tree path testing. Card sorting for labeling and organizational schemes, tree path testing for hierarchy and navigation paths, and to make sure that you don't have any dead ends. The program that we use that I really love is Optimal Workshop. They have 3 products. 2 of them are related to information architecture. The first is Optimal Sort. That's for online card sorting. And the second is TreeJack. It is IA pathing. So this is an example of Optimal Sort. You can see Optimal Sort. This is the result, actually. Ask people to sort things and label things the way that you want them. Sometimes you can tell them what labels you want to use and have them pick which one they like, or you can actually leave it as a blank slate and have them label things themselves. But basically, once all is said and done, you get this heat map, I guess cool map is what I'd call this with the blue, of what the majority of people call things and how they organize it. So you can pick the most commonly used labels and patterns using optimal sort. TreeJack is really cool because you put an information architecture into TreeJack and you tell people to figure out how to find a certain thing, and then they either do or they don't, or they think they did and they back up. But it's all analyzed by the program, and it's visually represented in these cool tree diagrams, which, without going into too much detail, basically give you a bird's eye view, excuse me, of how obvious certain paths are within your site. And you can dig down into each of those little circles that you see there to get even more information on exactly what's happened. So I highly recommend those. They cost a little bit of money, but if you're doing a major information architecture restructuring, well worth the price. Okay, the future of information architecture. And I know that we started a few minutes late, and I have a few slides. I have 10 more slides left. I'm going to try to get through them in the next 5 minutes. However, if I have to stop short, Mallory, let me know, and we might be over a couple minutes for questions, but hopefully we can get through this next section. Okay, so the future of information architecture. Extending Garrett's model across multiple platforms, multiple sessions, and with exponential information growth. So it's just getting more and more complex and more difficult. Again, this is already a pretty complex visual as it is. Can it get more complex? Well, of course it can, because you can picture another dimension of this that takes into account all the different versions of the site that you have because of responsive design. So if anyone ever says, oh, making web pages is easy, you pull up this diagram and you say, can you tell me what this is? This is my job. This is all the stuff that we do to create a website. And that'll end the conversation. And you win. See, I'm providing you winning slides. You can use this anytime, I promise. Okay. Data is also getting bigger, right? Bottom-up information architecture is going to become more and more important as data, not hierarchy, drives content. So database websites, what's a good example of that? Well, if anyone went to CNN during the 2012 presidential election, you were able to use this really cool interactive map that had all kinds of hover effects and pulling in dynamic information from left and right. And in order to get that box that says Nebraska, that says that Romney's going to beat Obama 60% to 38%, there is an enormous amount of metadata and tagging and processing that's going on behind the scenes just to get you that nice, neat box. And that is the direction that we're all headed in, is these types of sites that are so interactive and so data driven, and users are going to come to expect more and more. No, you don't have to be the next Amazon, but you definitely have to consider what bottom-up information architecture and data tagging can do for you. Okay, multi-platform browsing. We talked about a little bit, that people use different devices over different sessions. How about two devices during the same session? So this is where we're headed. We've got Apple saying you can be on your iPad and control your TV. Well, it's only a matter of time before you start to be able to browse certain things on a website and see them bigger on another screen. So that's another area that I think is going to be really interesting and evolving. Responsive design we all know about, and I've talked about a little bit, but definitely something that's going to continue to change the face of information architectures as we figure out how to fit complex IAs into smaller and smaller spaces. And then lastly is adaptive content. And this is essentially the same approach that responsive web design took with this time with content. And one of the people who's really steering this is Karen McGrane. She has this presentation about chunks, not blobs, which is just phenomenal. She talks about how NPR created this COPE strategy, which is create once, publish everywhere, which basically made their content completely agnostic from any style, layout, or device, in much the same way that the code for responsive web design makes it completely agnostic to what device it's being looked at. It uses lots of metadata and lots of XML. I won't say any more, but please do watch the presentation that she put together online. It's absolutely mind-blowing. Okay, lastly, but certainly not least, is the IA practice in higher ed. IA at your school needs to be established as a real thing, just like design, development, and content. You need to use case studies from industry. You need to insert IA into your training regimen, and you need to build up expertise among the staff who work in the UX family, which is pretty much, if you're a creative services group or work on the web, everybody that you work with. So who should do it? Well, ideally, you should have a dedicated information architect on staff. The reality is that's not going to probably happen anytime soon, so you need to at least have one person who owns information architect and is the key point person on campus. And your ultimate goal should be that all staff associated with the web need to be versed in IA. Take on the role of champion. Be a champion and demand IA be taken seriously. Use the tools at your disposal. Read, watch, listen, and learn. And that's all I've done over the years. There's lots of really smart people out there, a lot smarter than me, who are doing amazing things in this realm, and all you need to do is plug in. A lot of the content is free. Speaking of content that is free and not so free, here are the books and sites I would have you start with. Information Architecture for the World Wide Web, the book that links to the Amazon piece. Again, the Bible, in my opinion. Elements of User Experience, you could read in 3 hours, but will absolutely blow your mind. That's the Jesse James Garrett book that we were looking at the diagram of. Jesse James Garrett's website also has just the same diagrams online and a lot of stuff for free. And then Karen McGrain's website has all kinds of information on content strategy, including chunks, not blobs, and all kinds of other things such as that. Okay, exactly 3 o'clock. Thank you very much. Does anybody have time for any questions?
Yes, Fran, that was awesome. Definitely a lot of tweets happening. Let me share with you a couple of my favorites. Eric Olson said, information architecture requires a weird talent hybrid, incredible organizational skills and incredible creative artistry. Marissa Gagne said, remember who your users are. Doing testing with inappropriate audiences gives you inaccurate results. Allison West had one of my favorites. She said, how can you not stop for a cat with bacon on its head?
Well, right, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, really. And Alexandra Reed tweeted, my favorite definition, IA is the structured design of shared information environments. So 4 of the many tweets during your session. And we do have a few questions, and certainly people should feel free to tweet us or shoot questions through the GoToWebinar control panel. And now would be the time to use the raise your hand feature if you're interested in asking a question through your telephone or computer microphone. So, Fran, really quickly, a couple people were wondering if you could just repeat those products that you covered at the very end for information architecture testing.
Okay, yeah. The overall umbrella product is Optimal Workshop, and I can grab that actually. Let's see. Yeah, optimalworkshop.com is the site, and they break it up into 3 different products. Each one you can buy separately, or you can get them all together for a discount, of course. But Optimal Sort, TreeJack, and Chalkmark
Awesome.
are really the 3 that are best.
So John is wondering, or would be interested in hearing your thoughts on information architecture and reducing content for mobile devices.
Okay.
And how maybe that differs from, the desktop.
Yeah. So it's interesting because Karen McGrain in particular makes this argument that just because you're on a smaller screen does not mean that you can just arbitrarily start chopping off limbs of your information architecture. That it's on you to make sure that people can get the exact same information on your mobile site as they can on your full-fledged website. So the process of reducing information architecture to a mobile screen shouldn't really be one of, calling the herd, but more figuring out an interactive design approach that works well. And so, that example I used for Webster is good, where, you get down to the mobile view and you don't actually lose out on any of those items, but it all gets like grouped down into one button. And then you hit navigation, and then you can see, you've still got the navigation there, but imagine that on a touch screen, so you can get into that. So it's kind of like you're going to need a couple different interaction design approaches for your information architecture if you want to go with responsive.
Awesome. Eric is wondering and curious to hear your thoughts on content culling when conducting a content audit. What is your focus on, maybe getting rid of the less important content completely versus simply just deprioritizing it on the page?
This is tough because the process of figuring out all that content that you're supposed to get rid of takes a lot of time, and a lot of times it's hard to justify doing that. And it's easier to just be like, well, you know what, we'll just bury it and hope no one ever finds it. The problem with search engines is they can find everything. And so that's when you end up with somebody calling, asking to enroll for like prices that are circa 1995 because your financial aid page has been up somewhere in the ether for that long. So, I would say that ideally you'd want to do a full-fledged content audit, and if it's something that's irrelevant, if the page that's just not important anymore, just get rid of it. And if it's content itself on a page that needs to be culled, doing those content templates can really, really help provide a playground for those and define the walls. So if you come up with a content template that basically says you can't exceed 500 words on this page, and you can't exceed 5 subsections, and each of those subsections has to have a header, and here's how long the paragraphs have to be in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You've built yourself a nice constraint for your content, and then you can go back to that content that's just completely unruly. You can be like, okay, I need to make this huge thing fit into this small piece. What needs to go, and it'll make it a little bit easier to make some of those decisions. But it's not an easy process, and it's not a slow process, unfortunately.
Our next question comes from Rachel, and she is wondering what your recommendations or thoughts are on links for the front page, or I'm guessing she means homepage.
Depends on what you're trying to do. I mean, links for the homepage, if it's topical navigation, I would follow suit with what's been kind of standard, established as industry standard. Don't try to get creative and relabel academics as something other than academics, because your users are going to be looking at a half a dozen different school websites in one session, and if you're the only one who doesn't have academics clearly labeled within the topical navigation, then they're going to think that, well, they're probably just going to skip over it. If you're talking about other labeling, tips for labeling is just be as concise as you possibly can be while still conveying the essence of where they're going to end up, right? So if you've got the ability to describe something in 2 words instead of 3, do it in 2 words. If you can possibly do it, make and ampersand at every possible juncture. That saves 2 characters every single time. Just try to keep things as short and sweet as you possibly can. Try not to combine ideas or topics. If you can help it, have each link, act as a link to a single item if possible, so that people have that clearly articulated. So there's a couple small tips for you in general.
Cool. So that was our last question, and I just want to put in a quick plug for the episode on Higher Ed Live tomorrow night. It is titled, Why Does SEO Matter? And I think that, certainly people interested, I think, in information architecture are also often interested in search engine optimization. And so that's why I want to share this information with you folks on today's session. So tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Eastern at higheredlive.com/live, Kyle James from New Cloud will be hosting Why Does SEO Matter? He'll talk with Zach Vineyard from Northwest Nazarene University about the importance of SEO in .edu. So I think that'll be really interesting, and I hope we see some of the folks from this session tomorrow night at that episode. This is our last webinar for 2013. As I indicated at the beginning of the session, we're planning the webinars for 2014 as we speak. And so your feedback is really, really important to us today. As you leave, please feel free to let us know what topics you would like to see as webinars next year. This year, we offered, I believe, 13 complimentary webinars, so one a month, if not more. And we've had a really wonderful time doing it, and we want to make sure we offer just as many next year, and we want to make sure we're offering topics that you are interested in. So you can email me, mallory.wood@mstoner.com, or fill out that exit survey. Fran, this was an awesome session. Between the ninjas and the cats with bacon and the voice, I know I was laughing the entire time, and I imagine that a lot of our attendees were too. There's a lot of great action on Twitter, and I'm excited for you to go and check that out. So thanks so much for being with us today and sharing